Thanks very much. I'm David Sanger from the New York Times, and delighted to be here with Senator Murphy and Congressman Schiff, and have a little discussion about Russia and other issues in the news. I wanted to start, though, just with what we had on the front pages today. So, a somewhat remarkable situation where the president had his meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov and Ambassador Kislyak last week. We learned about the details of it in large part from photos that were issued by TASS because we didn't actually get in for any of those. But that apart, we've now read a set of descriptions of the conversation which seem to suggest that the president didn't issue any didn't reveal any sources and methods, but described a fairly sensitive intelligence around a program that concerns the ISIS ability to put laptops on computers that could be loaded up with explosives, and seemed to suggest the city in which some of this was learned and so forth. So, Congressman Schiff, since you sit on intelligence and are familiar with the difference between revealing sources and methods, which nobody's alleged here happened, and describing the program in some detail. Tell me what part of this we should be concerned about and what part isn't all that concerning.
Well, what we should be concerned about, and again, have not yet been briefed on it, so I can only go on the basis of what's been alleged publicly and what the administration response has been. But the allegation is that the president discussed a threat to the country from ISIS with sufficient detail that the Russians could determine what the source or method of gathering that intelligence was. So the denials by the administration, as I read them, and I'm reading admittedly between the lines, are really a form of non-denial denial. That is, stating that the president did not discuss war plans is a bit of a non sequitur. Saying that the president didn't specifically comment on sources or methods is also a bit of a ruse if, in fact, what the president did was reveal sufficient detail that the Russians could therefore conclude, reverse engineer in a way, what the actual source was. And what's the implication of that? Well, it could compromise the source of information, so that source could dry up or go away, or if it's a human source, it could be worse. If the source is a sister intelligence agency of a friendly country, that country could decide it can't trust the United States with information, or worse, that it can't trust the President of the United States with information. That obviously has very serious repercussions, and particularly if we're talking about information about a threat to Americans posed by ISIS. So, again, I can't say whether these allegations are accurate, but if they are, and certainly the President's tweets suggest that he talked about something of concern here, we immediately have to go into damage mitigation mode. Find out what steps can we take to minimize any risk to our sources, and if the damage is to our allies, what steps we can take to reassure our allies that we treasure the relationship, we treasure the information, and we're going to work much harder to protect it in the future. And then I have to hope that someone will counsel the President about just what it means to protect closely held information and why this is so dangerous ultimately to our national security.
For either of you, but Senator Murphy, let's start with you on this. The president made an argument in his tweet this morning that basically he's trying to bring the Russians over to be more active against ISIS. And we've certainly seen cases where presidents of both parties, President Obama, President Bush, revealed some intelligence information without the source in order to go motivate another country to help along. You might, to put it in another context, tell the Chinese more about the North Korean missile program if you're trying to give some urgency to the sense that they've got to back them up on sanctions. So could you argue that this is the kind of thing that presidents sometimes just have to do?
Well, you could argue that if you were under the belief, if you were under the belief that this White House was operating in a way that was anything other than foreign policy by improvisation. Yes, you are right that in previous times, other presidents have decided to share classified information with so-called adversaries, but they only did so after consulting with the intelligence agencies and having a whole of government approach to declassifying that information. It was strategic. This clearly, as far as we understand, was not strategic. And the idea that Russia is going to be a responsible partner in the future of Syria is belied by years and years of facts on the ground. We have been trying to get the Russians to be a meaningful partner inside Syria, and they end up doing more damage than good. They end up conducting themselves in a way that kills, hurts, and maims civilians such that more, not less, people on the ground inside Syria are pushed into the camps of extremists rather than to moderates. So we have enough experience inside Syria to understand that Russia is not going to be a credible partner, and you are right that there is a reasonable way to use classified information in order to win new friends or influence adversaries, but that's not what happened here. This was a president who was trying to show off how much he knew in the context of that meeting, and potentially did serious jeopardy to immediate U.S. national security concerns, as we are finding out today that some of our allies are already rethinking whether or not they should share information, or rethinking what kind of information they should share with the United States.
Can I just add, Chris is exactly right, and the point he's making is also far broader than this context. If you look at many of the president's statements or tweets that have an impact on foreign policy, they all have an improvisational character. Some have an erratic character to them. We try to look for a method in this when there may be none. And if you look at some of the comments he's made about North Korea, for example, and you ask, is this some part of a clever art of the deal strategy of saber rattling or whatnot, you might conclude that was true if this was done in concert with others in the administration in a cohesive fashion, but too often it's not. And it looks like the president has one foreign policy and the Secretary of State has another and the UN ambassador has the third, and no one is quite sure who to believe. And as much as we may try to rationalize it and explain it, the reality is that we have created not a strategic ambiguity, but a very non-strategic and dangerous ambiguity about where we are, what we stand for, what we want to see happen, what our policy is.
So we mentioned North Korea briefly. I wanted to turn to that before we get back into the Russia investigation. So the other fascinating intelligence leakage story that's going on right now is that it appears that the data that's been released by a group that calls itself the shadow brokers, which outside experts widely believe are tools that were developed by the NSA. I realize neither of you can comment on that, but let's take that for a moment as the working assumption of the question, if that turns out to be the case, have leaked out and now may have been exploited by the North Koreans to be used for greater havoc. So what should American taxpayers think about the fact that cyber weapons that are being developed by the United States are showing up in basically black markets and being exploited by our adversaries? Start with you, since I'm sure you've heard a bit on this topic within the committee.
Sure. Well, I think what this incident points up, and you're right, we can't confirm or comment on whether what the shadow brokers have disclosed either came from the U.S. or did not come from the U.S. But we do know a few things that the director of the NSA has said publicly, and that is from time to time we will discover vulnerabilities in software, including software of U.S. technology companies, that can be exploited in cases for very legitimate foreign intelligence gathering purposes. But of course, that also poses a great vulnerability. And there is a process within the administration, at least there was within the last administration, to determine whether the importance of that potential access outweighs the risks that those vulnerabilities get out into the wild and can be manipulated by bad actors. And according to Director Rogers, in 90% of the cases, the intelligence community reveals to the technology company, hey, you need to patch this vulnerability in your operating system or whatever the problem may be. I do think that one of the implications here is that if indeed this came from the United States, again, I can't confirm or deny whether it did, that will, I'm sure, influence that process more heavily in favor of disclosing to the technology companies a vulnerability, because we have seen now very graphically the risks of not disclosing to technology companies or having a quicker fix. And again, we don't know. It's possible if this was a U.S. government discovered vulnerability that it was disclosed to technology companies. It was only disclosed to Microsoft by their accounting relatively recently before they patched it in March. So it does raise the question, do we have this system under control? Well, this is a question I think that the committee will need to continue to examine and explore and decide whether there are changes that have to be made. Again, it's difficult to comment on in the abstract without being able to say this is the case here. I will say that it will have, I think, a demonstrable impact on one of the debates that we've been having in this arena, and that is the whole debate over encryption. Because, of course, one of the arguments the technology companies have made against any kind of a mandate that companies have a door, even with legitimate government process, in which the government can say, you need to decrypt for us, or you need to allow us into a particular device. I think the argument of the technology companies is now far greater potentially by saying, look, not even the US government, let alone our own company, can be trusted to protect a door or the keys to that door. So this will have implications even beyond the issue of the potential exploitation of zero-day vulnerabilities.
Over the course of the last 15 years, we've had a massive scale-up in conventional American military power, a doubling of the U.S. defense budget from the start of the Iraq War until 15 years later. We've had a massive scale-up of our ability to deploy cyber weapons around the world through a similar increase in funding for our intelligence agencies. There's the old saying that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks to you like a nail. And that is the reality of American foreign policy today. Let's talk about the only means by which we actually took a nuclear security threat off the table, at least for the time being. That was with respect to the Iranian nuclear agreement, an agreement that we achieved not through conventional military power. We certainly used cyber tools along the way, but that was not ultimately dispositive. And so this speaks to the broader imbalance that exists in the national security toolkit that's available to an American president. If all you have are cyber warfare tools and conventional warfare tools, then you simply can't meet the broad array of threats that are presented to the United States. So many of us are so deeply worried about these deep cuts to the State Department because we fear that this enormous plus up on the other side, A, leaves us vulnerable given the reality of cyber warfare vulnerabilities, but just misunderstands the way in which you actually solve some of these very complex problems, which ultimately won't be through internet attacks or conventional military buildup. It'll be through capacities that today the State Department has and can perfect.
Let me ask you for just a moment on the State Department, because you've raised this. So the president clearly is issued, at least in the skinny budget, at what they've called a national security budget. Want to increase the Defense Department, intelligence agencies considerably. State gets a 30% cut in that. I don't think anybody thinks that's likely to go through in that form. But what does that tell you about what the president thinks about the role of the State Department as an instrument of national security?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that he views foreign policy through a military lens, and that's not just evident in the way that he's budgeted, but through the fact that he has loaded up the national security cabinet with ex-military officers and still has left an entire level of professional service unappointed in the State Department. When we're here talking about big ideas, when I think about big ideas for the future, I think we should be talking about, instead of a $50 million increase in the military budget, we should be talking about what you could do with a $50 billion increase for the non-kinetic budget. The fact of the matter is, virtually all of these new threats that are posed to the United States, as I said, are not conventional military threats, whether it be bioterrorism or online terrorist recruiters, the spread of corruption, energy-rich petro-dictators. None of those threats can be confronted with the stuff that we very proudly make in Connecticut, submarines and helicopters and jet engines. Ultimately, those are State Department tools. So yes, I think this president views foreign policy through a military lens, but it fundamentally misunderstands how all of our adversaries today are confronting us with asymmetric power, not conventional military power.
And this is a point that I think our military understands, even if our president doesn't. Some of the most powerful advocates of the State Department have been secretaries of defense like Bob Gates. In the military, they have an expression, if you're going to cut diplomacy and development, you better buy me more bullets. I think vividly of being in Mosul many years ago with General Petraeus in the early stages of the Iraq War. And he had something when he was the head of the 101st on the chalkboard that said, essentially, money equals ammunition. And what he meant by that was the resources that they put into development projects were the equivalent of buying ammunition. The more they put Iraqis to work, the fewer Iraqis they had to fight, and the more support they built among the local population. That, I think, in microcosm is a good illustration of the fallacy of thinking that you can solve every problem by use of the military. And not only, I think, is the enormous cut in the State Department budget terribly wrong-headed, but a de-emphasis on development is equally the wrong direction to move in. Some of the bravest people I've met were at USAID, working in places like Afghanistan, and helping to build public trust, public confidence in the Afghan government. And if there's any core problem in Afghanistan, just to use that example, it's not the building up of the Afghan forces, as important as that is. It's the failure of the government to attack the problem of corruption and to give Afghans a sense of hope and confidence that their government is worth fighting and dying for. And you don't build that just through a defense budget. You build that through the State Department and USAID and the whole range of tools in the toolbox, not simply the military tool.
And Senator, when you hear these arguments and you convey them to Secretary Tillerson, either through the committee process and so forth, what kind of responses are you getting? What's your impression of how Senator Tillerson has dealt with this issue that both of you have discussed here?
Well, he's talking to us about as much as he's talking to you.
Well, it's not soaking up a lot of your time.
No, listen, I think Tillerson has communicated what he's at the State Department to do. I don't view Tillerson very differently than I view someone like Scott Pruitt or Betsy DeVos. I think that Tillerson is inside the State Department to undermine it, and I know that because he is going through a reorganization of the State Department with an end goal already decided. He has announced that at the end of that process there will be 2,300 less personnel in the State Department, which again fundamentally misunderstands the threats that are presented to us. Bring it back to Russia for a moment. Russia does not want to militarily own Ukraine. What they want to do is use this buildup of separatist forces in eastern Ukraine as a means to politically and economically destabilize Kyiv so that eventually you have installed, again, a pro-Kremlin leader of the Ukrainian government such that they are brought back into their orbit. Ultimately, you cannot confront that with military power. You have to give the Ukrainians the anti-corruption tools, the economic revitalization tools, the energy independence tools to be able to survive what may be a long-term occupation of their eastern front. And yet, this administration seems to see Ukraine as a military problem, just as they see many of these other problems through that lens. And in the end, that is a recipe for failure.
Congressman Schiff, let's turn back to the Russia investigation for a bit. Your committee has famously got off to a rocky start, if I can put it politely. But now you've got a chairman who seems committed, from at least his public statements, to actually conduct a big investigation and a thorough one. As you look at the two big baskets of this investigation, first, what the Russians did in the election, how they did it, what parts of it may have been successful, what parts may not have been, how you would prevent it. And secondly, was there any collusion or collaboration with anybody affiliated with any of the presidential campaigns? Give us sort of a rundown of what you think are the big questions and what early answers, if you've gotten to any yet, you think you have on those.
Well, I always like to start out in talking about the investigation by answering perhaps the most important question, which is, why should people care about this? Is this an effort to simply relitigate the election, as the president wants to suggest, or is there something far more significant here? And as important as the issue of collusion is, and the issue of just what active measures did the Russians employ to interfere in our election, was there collusion? Was there compromise? Was there blackmail? Was there the use of paid media trolls? Was there the use of their slick propaganda campaign? How many of the tactics that the Russians have used elsewhere in the world did they employ here? As important as that is, we have to understand the broader context. The Russians hacked into our election not simply because they hated Hillary Clinton and wanted to see Donald Trump elected, as important as that was, but rather because they wanted to tear down our democracy. And not our democracy alone. They obviously want to tear down the democracy in France. They'd like to see Angela Merkel gone. They'd like to see the dissolution of Europe. And what we are engaged in really is a new war of ideas. It's not communism versus capitalism, but it is autocracy and authoritarianism against democracy and representative government. That's really what is at stake. And having a keen understanding of what the Russians did here is not only important in terms of whether there are U.S. persons involved that need to be brought to justice, but also how do we protect ourselves in the future, and how do we protect our allies, indeed, how do we protect liberal democracy around the world. What just took place in France, and we're still looking to confirm the responsible parties and the tactics that were used, was one of the profound fears that I had of our own election, and that is, while the Russians hacked and dumped documents in the United States, my biggest worry was not that they were going to hack into voting machines, which would be very difficult since most are offline and most others have paper trails, but rather that they would hack and dump forgeries among the real, or worse still, real documents with forged paragraphs, and forged paragraphs that suggested illegality by a candidate. That would be almost impossible, if not impossible, to refute in the weeks leading up to an election, and particularly with a polarized electorate. No one would believe the refutation even if you could make it. This is what we may face in the next round. And there is no way to cyber defend your way against this. We all need to improve our cyber defenses. They're never going to be good enough. The Russians are capable enough. If they want to hack into an institution, they will find a way in. The only way to truly protect ourselves is to inoculate ourselves, is to inform the public, this is what they do, this is how they do it. Both parties need to reject it, regardless of whether it helps one or hurts the other. We have to forge a national consensus. We will not allow a foreign power to meddle in our affairs. And this is why I think the investigation is so important. So there are a number of baskets of issues we're looking at. We're looking at whether the intelligence community got it right in their assessment of not who did it, because there's no question about that, but what the motivations were and how much of this was about injuring the democracy generally or helping Trump or hurting Hillary. But also, what was the U.S. government response? How soon did we recognize this was not simply a foreign intelligence gathering operation by the Russians, but they intended to weaponize the data? And if that wasn't the goal at the outset, when did it become the goal? And what other tactics did the Russians use? All of this we need to know not only in terms of justice considerations, but also because the most fundamental point is how we protect our democracy in the future.
Senator, a last one for you because I see we're running out of time here, but if you look at the French election, couldn't you argue that that education process that Congressman Schiff has described actually worked to some degree? I mean, the last dump of data, those last 72 hours before the election, got pretty much dismissed. It was pretty transparent effort. And by the time we were all done looking at this, it did not seem to have had any kind of the effect that the Russians may have, or whoever the perpetrators were, may have intended. Does that give us sort of a guide going forward?
Well, I think it may, but for the fact that we had to be the guinea pig, right, that did it wrong before the French figured out
it's got to be
how
someone,
to do it right. Yeah, and so yes, if you are the second victim of an attack that looks very much like the first, then you may be able to develop a series of prophylactics against it. But if the Russians invent a new way of trying to manipulate an election along the lines of what Adam is talking about, and you are the first, then you may not have the flexibility and the nimbleness in order to respond the right way. With respect to the investigation, before we leave, I just think it's important to talk about the subject that will dominate the news for the next few days. I have all the faith in the world in Adam Schiff. I don't necessarily, there's a but. There's a but. I don't though, ultimately in the end, have faith in the Republicans that are members of both the committees in the House and the Senate. And I worry, as many of my colleagues do, that ultimately only a professional special prosecutor can get to the underlying facts here, in part because the intelligence committees in the House and the Senate are not by nature investigative bodies. And I think at this point we understand that no matter who is put into the FBI, they have been sent a pretty clear signal by the White House that if they actually pursue the facts where they lead, they are likely to get fired, or at the very least neutered. There is no perfect way to do this investigation. There's a flaw in every single one of the avenues to the truth. But I think you will see mounting pressure this week to move towards a special prosecutor, in part because many of us worry about a political process inside the Congress being ultimately stymied by Republicans, and those of us who do not have faith that the FBI will ever get the necessary green light, no matter how good the civil servants inside the FBI are. And so this will be a dominant narrative this week that ultimately I hope is dispositive on Republicans in the end.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time and don't have time to grab questions. I wanted to thank you both for taking the time to have this discussion, and appreciate you doing this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.